Tonight we have Alice Yuan Zhang, who joins us, a media artist who joins us from Los Angeles. And here physically in the room with me at Stanford, we have Jen Dayon from Stanford University and Ade Mabugunje, also from Stanford University. Each speaker will give a 20-minute presentation followed by Q&A. And so I will introduce each one separately. My introductions are notoriously very brief. Jennifer has done this 3 or 4 times, so she will not be shocked by my very brief bios introductions. But if you go to lasertalks.com, you find a link to their web pages and extensive bios. Alice Yuan Zhang is a media artist based between Berlin and Los Angeles. Among her many activities, let me read just 1 or 2 lines. Among her many activities during the pandemic, she co-founded the digital community space Virtual Care Lab, and I'm sure you'll talk more about your activities. Okay, I mute myself. I will also kill my video to give you maximum bandwidth. Okay, all yours, Alice. Okay, all yours.
Thank you for waiting. So as I was mentioning, my name is Alice Yuan Zhang, and I make projects about socio-ecological entanglement, and I'm a media artist. So more and more so I've been thinking about, the bridge between ecology and technology, and not just storytelling about ecological renewal and interspecies relations and ethnobotany and cultural memory through new media, which are projects that I have done in the past years. Today, I wanted to talk more about thinking about technology from an ecological standpoint in terms of the technological stack and the kind of notion of progress and futurity that is wrapped into our imagination around tech. So lately, I've been thinking a lot about infrastructure, and what I mean by infrastructure is all kinds. So technological, like the protocols and the cables that we depend on when we go online, such as right now, with my laptop struggling to try and connect and present this information to you and you in the room. And ecological infrastructure as well, like mycelial networks underground, and also relational, like who we reach out to when we're sick, and thinking about mutual aid networks and so on. So I think when I'm considering infrastructure, and today we'll be talking specifically about technological infrastructure, all of these layers are there, and it's a matter of needs and dependencies. So I mentioned, again, as a media artist, that I engage with these various digital technologies, and I do so strategically, choosing these digital mediums to work with in order to meet folks where they are and to be able to have important conversations together. But along the way, I have been growing more aware that these technologies are not neutral, and across the techno-capitalist industries, and most recently in AI, blockchain, geoengineering, et cetera, and moving into quantum, a lot of these developments have further exacerbated class and race-based oppression, and access and especially agency are reserved for the few, the privileged few, to plan oftentimes and to imagine, societal planning for the whole world over, while the rest of society bear the burden of sustaining these increasingly complex systems. So I have been doing research over the past year, looking at the technological infrastructure that media artists depend on, as well as, more and more folks across the globe, and especially with mandates of digital inclusion, digital literacy, and also, thinking more about what we mean by technology, and what do we have a choice to reimagine, and what sorts of worldviews can we rely on to think about this differently. So I wanted to bring in a cultural anthropologist that I really appreciate, whose work I really appreciate, Arturo Escobar, who talks about the way that we design technology, but also that technology in turn designs us back. So to share this quote, every tool or technology inaugurates a set of rituals, ways of doing, and modes of being. It contributes to shaping what it is to be human. So in this way, as I do with, throughout my practice, I like to think from a subjective point of view and from, a culturally situated and an embodied point of view to call in other worldviews. And so I'd like to share a little bit about, this other way of thinking about time. So counter to linear progress, an intergenerational framework, if we can imagine, regeneration and renewal that we desperately need right now, an intergenerational framework recognizes that the Earth operates not on a longer time scale than an agile sprint, but in a cyclical one altogether. So in terms of, the capitalist chronology, the reason that we need to talk about time is that technology or technological innovation in the hegemonic sense has been built on this idea of capitalist futurity, right? So moving from past to be buried into this frantic accelerationist future, and kind of producing and consuming our way toward it. And rather, if we can imagine beyond the idea of linear progress, then can we imagine maybe, a cyclical time cycle altogether? And how might that apply to, the way that we approach technology differently? So in thinking about cycles of life, then we think about lifespans, right? And we think about, our own births and deaths and where we come from and where we'll go. And the thing about technology and, well, currently the devices that hold digital communications and these networks, and even a lot of the infrastructure that we don't see, like in tucked away and far away data servers, and with cell towers that are disguised as trees, a lot of what we don't see is, complex electronics that have been pieced together, from a very nuanced, intricate supply chain that touches a lot of places around the world. And then once it's used and we are done with it, then where does it go? So this question of, if electronics don't ever decompose, which they don't for literally 1,000,000 years, then how do we think about that? And I think from an artistic and a spiritual perspective, like how do we bring in this theme of grief? So grief has been really interesting as I mention often, like as a wrench to throw into otherwise merely logical analysis of what might be the best way forward. But we often dismiss, especially in Western society, longstanding practices of reflection and collective reflection. These practices like grief as stasis, right? So going back to what we were just mentioning about how time flows, if we're only concerned with the future, then we have no need for grief. But that's far from the truth, right? So, I'm curious to think against this era of progress and to feel in our bodies and with each other, the complexities, the complicities, the dependencies that we're in our technological relations. So something that I have been doing this year is an iteration of technological grief rituals as a way of understanding deeper material relations. What you see here as the visual is I'm hosting one such grief ritual, but in the background is actually a rendition of creatures from the Carboniferous era, 300 million years ago. And the reason why I'm thinking about the carboniferous creatures and seeking to grieve them is that the carbon footprint of the internet has now surpassed that of the airline industry. So it's about 3 or 4% of the overall carbon footprint. And more than half of the electricity from the US is still derived from fossil fuels. So, you know, we might think that that the fuel is simply a sterile resource, and you know, but if we think more at a farther time scale than that, then actually it comes from, right, the remains of these carbon-rich trees and creatures. This whole time period that was once at the surface of the planet, that now has condensed into the ground. And so what does it mean for us to be pulling you know, the remains of this time period 300 million years ago out of the ground and under extractive labor conditions, right? As well as mining metals and minerals that make up our electronics. And can we think about that as, in a way, borrowing deep geological time? And what are the problematics of that? And so to grieve the materiality of technology and of energy, et cetera, is not necessarily to lead us to, you know, an altogether better solution, but it at least begins by recognizing the life in them. And so in grieving, we want to, you know, perhaps wish our grief subjects an afterlife, and yet nothing that makes up this metallic sprawl of the last few decades will decompose. And so what else happens to all of the material, right? And meanwhile, the ghosts of planned obsolescence linger in the water, in the soil, in the air, and of course in our bodies. This is another image of that comes from how I facilitate the technological grief rituals. And it's been very interesting that, you know, through each iteration, it's a sort of performance lecture or a way that I open up discussion, and you know, and so in posing this question of grief, then people respond in all sorts of interesting ways about what they would personally like to grieve, and what our day-to-day experiences have been in terms of the lives and deaths of technology, both what you know, what has been dictated as lives and deaths by you know, by these larger corporations and the narratives there, but then also how we might reinterpret that for ourselves. And so this is an instrument of sorts, a technological grief altar that I have made to help facilitate this. And I wanted to just offer a brief moment of noticing this in our body and observing the aliveness of our body in this moment and how it feels like to breathe. And remembering, you know, where it has gone, this body through the histories of time, and in this lifetime that we're in now, and in our lifespan, and in the previous lifespans that have carried us here, and what we eat in the day-to-day, and everything that we depend on outside of just digital technology. And I think this is really important to recognize then the ecosystem as also our body, right? And so the way that we think about, you know, the aliveness of the soil and the aliveness of our own bodies carries over to, you know, the way that we move our breaths through and consider carbon cycles, for example, and how, yeah, all of the other material moves on this planet. And so this is another project that I had done in the past couple months called Anatomy of an Intergenerational Router, in which I think about my own body and the way that it already transmits and receives signals, and kind of harkens back to what is needed really as a precursor of then whatever technological solutions we might be appropriate for day-to-day living, for connecting. Yeah, just coming back to the body and coming back to that ultimate question of what do we need and why are we creating what we're creating technologically. So I'm noticing that I'm a little bit short on time now, and there's many more stories I would love to share with you about basket weaving and so on, and Taoist hacking, but I think I'll just bring it to a close for now as we think about what an intergenerational way of working on the world might look like, and how that might apply to a technological imaginary. So I would like to propose that an intergenerational way of working on the world does not focus on building, but on healing. And a worm feasting on food scraps knows better than anyone that death itself is a beginning. So grief poses an important inquiry into the material relation across everything that makes up our technological lives, and with that, the possibility to re-relate anew. Traditional healing methods teach us to stay attuned to where the ecosystemic body may be out of balance and to find pressure points for undoing harm. And breath itself is the keeper of cyclical time, reminding us to notice just how permeable we are in the motions of things. And this is by far not a comprehensive slide, and it is also not meant to be a solutionist slide, but it does show kind of this an amalgamation of C's perhaps as we think about what an intergenerational approach to technology might look like, and also alludes to some movements that are already ongoing that this idea can latch onto. And so, when we think about planned obsolescence, for example, we can draw parallels between the way that we dispose of technologies and especially the material bodies of technology, between that and humans and human lives and human bodies, by thinking about ageism and retirement and how folks are not taken care of once we get older, right? We can also think about crypt futurity and crypt tech and that movement that is ongoing, and how it's not necessarily about fixing the body, but it's about kind of furthering liberation of how folks are already living, and with crypt tech, thinking about ways to really support that and support kind of the hacking mentality of being able to live as is, without necessarily bending to the productivity of capitalism and a certain legibility of healthiness and so on. And so many other movements around minimal and low tech and the idea of appropriate technology, as well as ongoing projects, right, that often don't get the light of day and discourse around tech innovation, but are very much making strides in already thinking in more situated needs-based ways about how to implement technology. So things like community mesh networks, that are really designed not just for the sake of digital inclusion into the larger internet, but are designed towards specific needs in village and neighborhood and community contexts. And so I think there's a lot more here, a lot more examples that could go on the slide about how we can begin to think about an approach to technology that is life affirming, and that is needs based, and that is collaborative and regenerative, rather than necessarily the linear progress story that has been the loudest from the capitalist standpoint. And what I mentioned about these solutions, not as solutions, but as kind of strategies that make sense in whatever situated context, just thinking about intergenerational technologies, and how to imagine that as a strategy and not, a stable solution for a sterile world, but sees that adapt in a living one, so it can feel like a recipe, to be practiced and adapted to place, and therefore to find a sort of resilience and technologies that will, support that resilience of life, especially under the multiple crises that we're in right now. Yeah, and then lastly, to weave intergenerational technology is in a way to hyperlink time, grafting longstanding wisdom onto contemporary struggles. And for lack of time, I invite you to do your own search into this, the story called The Dexterous Butcher, which is a Taoist story by Zhuang Zi. And I think it's also another way of thinking about, the tool and how it's the idea of technology as beyond the prescription of the tool and the affordance of the tool, but really how you move with it and how you move through needs in the world. And I'll leave it there. And this is the rest of my ongoing research from the last year that you can take a look at. And I'm quite active on Instagram as well if you want to follow along with project updates.
Very good. Thank you, Alice.